Before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon, she loved that crisp, biting morning air. It was her escape, her refuge from the noise of life and the chaos that always seemed to follow her around. Every morning, like clockwork, she would lace up her shoes and slip out of the house before the world even stirred. The rhythmic pounding of her feet on the pavement and the steady thump of her heartbeat in her ears had become her solace. Her early morning jog was the one thing she could control. But lately, something had changed. A creeping unease had started to settle in, wrapping around her like a shroud every time she set foot on that familiar path. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you stop dead in your tracks. No, this was the kind that slithered into your subconscious, slowly but surely gnawing at your mind until you couldn't ignore it anymore. It started as just a feeling, a twinge in the back of her mind, a little voice whispering that she wasn't alone. She would whip her head around, scanning the dimly lit park, the trees casting long, sinister shadows, and every time her eyes would meet, nothing. The paranoia grew stronger with each passing day, like a shadow that kept stretching, no matter how fast she ran. She started carrying pepper spray, her fingers wrapped tightly around it, ready to defend herself against whatever or whoever was lurking in the dark. But even that didn't help. It was just a security blanket, a flimsy shield against a threat she couldn't see. Daniel, her friend, had laughed it off. "You're just scaring yourself," he said with that carefree smile of his. "It's your mind playing tricks on you." He was always so calm, so collected, and for a while his words soothed her frayed nerves. She trusted him. After all, he was the steady, rational one when her thoughts spiraled into fear. So, on that fateful morning, she decided to push through the dread. She threw on her leggings, tied up her hair, blasted her favorite playlist, and told herself that today would be different. She'd run, like she always did, and prove to herself that everything was fine. The air was cool, the pavement slick beneath her feet, and for a brief moment, she felt the usual rush of calm as she slipped into her routine. Then, it happened. Out of nowhere, a figure stepped onto the path in front of her, tall and imposing, his hood pulled low over his face. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a sudden, violent surge of panic crashing through her. Her hand flew to the pepper spray, fingers trembling as she fumbled with it. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice raw, desperate, the sound echoing in the stillness of the early morning. The figure didn't move, and then, slowly, deliberately, the hood came down. It was Daniel. Relief flooded her, washing away the fear in a dizzying rush. She laughed, shaky and embarrassed. "Daniel, what the hell? You scared me." But Daniel didn't laugh. He smiled, a strange, twisted grin that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze was dark, unsettling, and something about the way he was standing, the way he was looking at her, it wasn't right. "You've always been safe with me," he said, stepping closer. "I've been watching over you for weeks." Her blood ran cold. The words echoed in her mind, a sickening realization sinking in. Watching? For weeks? It all came together in an instant. The creeping feeling of being followed, the unease that had been gnawing at her for days, the shadows that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. He had been there the whole time. Before she could react, his hands were on her waist, his grip firm, possessive. Her body went rigid with shock. "Daniel, stop," she whispered, but her voice cracked, betraying the terror that was rising in her throat. She raised the pepper spray, her hand shaking, but he slapped it out of her grip with a swift, brutal motion. In an instant, his fingers wrapped around her throat, squeezing hard enough to make her vision blur at the edges. She clawed at his hands, gasping for air, her heart hammering in her chest as she struggled against him. His breath was hot against her ear, and his voice was venomous, dripping with a twisted sense of ownership. "I kept you safe," he snarled. "Why aren't you grateful? I've been watching over you, protecting you." Her mind was screaming, every instinct telling her to fight, to run, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. She could feel herself slipping away, her vision darkening, her strength fading as his grip tightened. The world around her was shrinking, the edges of her consciousness blurring. But then, just when she thought it was over, she heard it. Dogs barking. The sound pierced through the fog of her fading consciousness, and then a man's voice. "Let her go." Daniel's grip loosened for just a moment, just long enough for her to suck in a ragged breath. He looked over his shoulder, startled, and then, like a coward, he bolted, disappearing into the trees, swallowed up by the darkness that had once been his cover. She collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably as the older man rushed over to her. His face was lined with concern as he helped her to her feet, his hands steady as he guided her out of the park. She clung to him, too weak, too shaken to speak. At the police station, she told them everything: the weeks of unease, the creeping feeling of being watched, and the horrifying truth about Daniel. He had been her friend, or so she had thought. But now she realized that the man she had trusted had been stalking her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when he could make his move. The next day, Daniel was gone. He didn't show up for class. Instead, the police found him, and with a twisted sense of righteousness, he confessed to it all. His final words chilled her to the bone. She needed me. Only I could protect her. But she didn't need protecting from the shadows. She needed protecting from him. In the days that followed, she struggled to feel safe again. Every dark corner, every shadow, every flicker of movement sent her heart racing. The world had changed. She had changed, because now she knew the truth. The real monsters don't hide in the woods. They hide in plain sight.